Today is Easter, and on Easter, we as a church, but also churches all around the world, celebrate the resurrection of Jesus. And also today, we're in the middle of this series through the book of Romans. If you've been here with us for a while, we've been going through the book of Romans, which is a letter that the Apostle Paul wrote to the church in Rome in the first century. And we intentionally set this up because today we're actually in Romans chapter 8, and Romans 8 is kind of like the climax of Paul's argument in the first part of Romans. And what he's going to explain in Romans 8 is, why is the resurrection so important? What does it mean? Because Paul's going to say that the resurrection means something super important to you and I. And so what I want to do today is, first I want to talk just a little bit about the resurrection. And then I want to look in Romans 8 and see why Paul argues it's significant for us, what it means for us today. And so let's talk a little bit about just resurrection. I can't prove this. I don't have like a scientific study or a survey or anything, but I have a hunch that if you asked most people what is the foundation of Christianity, they would say the Bible. That typically churches define themselves as like, we're a Bible-believing church, or that's even how people would define themselves. Like, I'm a person who all my actions and everything is founded on the Bible. I'm a Bible-believing Christian. And I don't want to take away from the importance or significance of the Bible. I love the Bible. But I think sometimes we forget that Christianity existed before the Bible as we know it. Like, there was a period of time where Christianity was growing and thriving, and they didn't have the Bible that you and I have. Now, the first part of the Bible, called the Old Testament, which is the story of ancient Israel, that was around like 400 years before Jesus even shows up. But then the New Testament, the second part of the Bible, which is like really kind of the foundation of Christian faith, that's not written till a while after Jesus and his life and his death and his resurrection. And so the actual foundation of Christian faith is the resurrection, because that's when Christianity begins. It begins that first Easter morning. It begins with the resurrection of Jesus. On that first Easter morning, you know how many Christians there were in the world? 0. Not one. Because a Christian, when you look at it, a Christian is someone who like follows Jesus and believes that Jesus is Lord and Savior, and that he's God in the flesh, and that he died and he rose again. That first Easter morning, there was not a single person that believed Jesus was going to raise from the dead. If you read through the first part of the Old Testament, Jesus will tell his followers, he'll be like, hey, I'm going to die and I'm going to raise again, but no one believed he actually was going to. See, I think sometimes it's easy for us to look back in history, and we look back 2,000 years ago and we think, you know what? People were just a little bit simpler 2,000 years ago. They weren't as advanced. They didn't know everything that we know. So it was probably just easy for them to believe things that you and I just know better. But that's really kind of an arrogant way to look back at people. And quite honestly, people in the first century were not dumb. It's not like resurrection was a common thing in the first century. Like, you'd walk around and be like, oh, look, there's Stacy, she resurrected. And there's Steve, he resurrected too. Good for that. Like, it didn't happen. It was just as difficult for people to believe in the first century as it would be for you and I. And so Jesus, at the time of his death, there's people that give different numbers, but he probably only has about 100 followers at the time of his death. And not one of them believed he was coming back to life. Like, when Jesus was killed, and then they buried him in this kind of like a little cave thing called a tomb. They buried him in this little tomb. All his followers, all his friends were like, it's over. The whole movement he started is over. It was fun while it lasted, had some good times, did some good stuff, but it's finished. We're told in the New Testament that there's this group of ladies that goes to visit Jesus' tomb. And they're taking spices to visit his tomb. The reason they're taking spices is because when someone dies, their body starts to decay. Now, one of the benefits of burying someone underground is you don't have to smell the decay. But when you just put them in like a little cave and like roll a rock in front of it, that decaying odor like seeps out. So if you wanted to honor someone that you really cared about, you would take strong smelling spices to their tomb and you would put them there, because the spices would cover up the smell of the decay. It was a way to honor this person that you loved that was now dead. The reason these ladies took spices is because when they got to his tomb, they expected him to be in there dead and decaying. And so they get there and they find that the tomb is open and his body's gone. And their first reaction is not, oh good, he resurrected. Their reaction is, someone stole his body. Well, how do you know someone stole his body? Well, because he's dead and he's not in there, and dead people can't walk away, so someone else had to take him. They run back and they tell a bunch of their other friends, like, hey, someone stole his body. We don't know what to do. There's one story where Jesus actually shows up and he's talking to one of these ladies, actually having a full-on conversation, and she thinks it's the gardener. She doesn't even recognize him. Because again, she's not looking for him. She's not expecting to see him. And so you have all these crazy like post-resurrection stories where people would see Jesus and encounter Jesus, and other people like, yeah, I don't believe you. I mean, I watched him die. That's great that you said you saw him. I don't think he's alive until I see it myself. There's one story where Jesus is walking along the road with these two guys for a pretty significant period of time, and they're having a conversation, and they don't recognize him. Because again, in their mind, they're not thinking, I'm never going to see this guy again. Why? Because he died. Like no one, not one single person believed that Jesus was going to come back to life. And so when it happened on that Easter, it like blew people's minds. And his earliest followers, they struggled to understand it. They struggled to believe it. They struggled to accept it because it's not normal. It doesn't happen. It's miraculous. But his resurrection then becomes the foundation of Christianity. Because from that point on, that's when the church really emerges and this movement takes off, and it ultimately spreads all over the Mediterranean world. It overcomes the Roman Empire and becomes the largest movement the world has ever seen. And what kickstarted it was the resurrection. The New Testament that we have, you know why the New Testament was written? Because of the resurrection. Nobody wrote anything about Jesus until after he resurrected. And then people wrote all kinds of stuff and put it all over the place. See, the foundation of Christian faith is the resurrection, so much so that the Apostle Paul, who writes a big chunk of the New Testament, this is what he says about the resurrection. 1 Corinthians 15, he says, and if Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is your faith. Paul doesn't say this about anything else, only the resurrection. He says, listen, if Jesus didn't resurrect, if he didn't come back to life, then the whole point of my life, everything I've given my life to, the purpose of my life is pointless, and so is your faith. I don't care if your faith makes you a nicer person. I don't care if it helps you cope during difficulties, if it makes the world easier. If Jesus didn't raise from the dead, according to Paul, your faith is absolutely pointless. It means nothing. And so the foundation of Christian faith, what births Christian faith, what ultimately leads to the expansion of is the resurrection, is these earliest followers of Jesus. They were they believed with everything that Jesus rose from the dead. Now, here's an interesting thing kind of historically within the Western world that you and I live in. Our world, our culture, our worldview has very much been shaped by really kind of three philosophical movements that have existed in the Western world. The Renaissance, the Scientific Revolution, and the Enlightenment. And these were kind of these movements that kind of shaped how we understand reason and truth and logic and science and all that kind of stuff. And there's a lot of good things that came out of those movements. One of the effects, one of the consequences, one of the lasting consequences is what those movements did is they took anything that we would classify as faith or religion and they privatized them. And here's what I mean by that. Like there's certain things that we will just talk about as like, this is scientific truth. You know, the sky is blue. And so we'll debate things as, hey, this is true about nature. But when it comes to issues of faith or religion, and this, I'm not just talking about Christianity. You can pick any religious tradition, any faith tradition. When it comes to religion or faith, we don't talk about that in the same way that we talk about other truth. Religion and faith is kind of put in this other category, and it's like, well, you can believe whatever you want to believe. And if it helps you, if it makes you a better person, that's great, and that's your thing. And if it works for you, that's awesome. But religion and faith, it's not the same as this like kind of scientific truth stuff. And so that's really the way that our culture operates. And that's the way that a lot of us who live in that culture, even if we would describe ourselves as people of faith or religious people, we kind of operate with that same thing, that religion is kind of its own category, and then you have like public truth. But if you look at the earliest followers of Jesus, they didn't have that same worldview. And so when they talked about the resurrection of Jesus, they talked about it as it's public truth. It's true in the same way that the sky is blue. And what's really interesting is in our Western kind of worldview, because we have privatized faith, we talk about the resurrection as if it's something that you can't really know. You can't really know it the way you know other scientific things or other historical facts. It's part of faith. But here's what's interesting. If you go 2,000 years ago, All right, the time that Jesus died and rose again. How do we know anything happened? You weren't there. I wasn't there. We didn't have video cameras. We didn't have pictures. How do we know that anything happened? It's simple. People saw it, and then they wrote about it. I was there. Here's what happened. Or you had other people who interviewed people who saw it. And they interviewed them, and hey, this is what this person said happened. Okay? How do we know the resurrection happened? The exact same way. We literally have the same evidence for the resurrection that we do for any other historical event from that period. Because sometimes, again, we think of the Bible as like God like beamed the Bible down, like boom, here it is. But we forget that the Bible, and specifically focusing on the New Testament, is just a whole bunch of different individual writings. The people just wrote these things. And over time, the church kind of took its most important writings and put them all into one collection. And so the New Testament opens up with 4 biographies of Jesus. We call them Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Matthew and John were 2 of Jesus' closest friends. 2 of the 12, 2 of the apostles. And so what they write in their biography is, here's an account of what I saw. And I saw him die, and then a few days later, he cooked a group of us breakfast on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. That's what I saw. And so this is what I'm writing down. And then the other 2 gospel writers, who are Mark and Luke, they didn't see it themselves, but they interviewed people who saw, and they said, hey, I did the research, I interviewed all these people, here's what they told me they saw. And then you have Paul, who in one of the letters Paul writes, Paul gives a list of like 500 people, and he goes, here's people who all saw the resurrection. If you don't believe it, ask them. And so literally, when it comes to the resurrection, we have the same evidence for the resurrection that we have for any other specific event that happened at that time. And so it frustrates me when people talk about like, oh, you can't know that the resurrection happened. Listen, you don't have to believe Matthew and John. Because there's all different kinds of things that we've recovered, like historical documents or things that for whatever reason, people look at and go, yeah, I don't believe that one, or I don't believe this person, or I don't believe that. So you can look at it and go, you know what, for whatever reason, I don't believe John, I don't believe Matthew, I don't believe the eyewitnesses that Luke and Mark interviewed, I don't believe Paul. You can totally say that. But you can't say that we can't know the resurrection happened in the same way that we know that other things happened. Because we have the same evidence for that we do for anything else. And so for the earliest followers of Jesus, the resurrection was public truth. That's how they talked about it. It happened. Here's the eyewitnesses that saw it. You can talk to them. And so you have this event, what the early followers described as public truth, as historical fact. The resurrection is this thing that happened. Jesus was dead, and then he came alive. And their argument ultimately was not just that the resurrection was an event, but that event had significance for everybody. And this now is what Paul is going to address in Romans 8. In Romans 8, Paul is going to answer the question that we introduced in the very beginning, that's simply, what does the resurrection mean for us? Okay, this thing happened, this event happened, but what does it mean? Why is it important? Why 2,000 years later do we still gather together and talk about it? Why is it the foundation of this worldwide movement? And so before we look at what Paul says in Romans 8, we kind of have to understand how Paul opens his letter to the church in Rome. The foundation of the book of Romans is this word Paul uses, the gospel. And gospel means good news. And that good news is rooted in Jesus and what it is that Jesus has done for us. But Paul actually begins Romans by giving us bad news. Because in order for there to be good news, there has to be bad news first. And so the bad news that Paul lays out in the opening chapters of Romans is that every single one of us, every single person who's ever lived on this planet is guilty. And it's funny because Paul starts off his argument by painting like, here's the worst of the worst, like these people are awful. But then Paul turns and goes, even if you think you're really good, you're not in any better shape than these people. And Paul says the reason that we're all guilty is because of sin. Now, for Paul and for the rest of the New Testament writers, sin isn't just I broke a rule. That's typically how we think of sin. Like God established a rule and we broke it, now God's angry with us. Sin is always relational in that when we sin, we violate a relationship. Now, it could be our relationship with God. It could be our relationships with one another. It could be our relationship to the rest of creation. Or it even could be in our relationship to ourselves. See, we were created as people to live in connection with God and connection with others. We were given creation to manage and to do something with and to lead. And we as people were designed to live like healthy, full lives. And so whenever we do something that violates any of that violates our relationship with each other, violates our relationship with God, that violates our own self, or that violates the role we're supposed to have in caring for creation, that's sin. And Paul says the reality is all of us have done that. Yeah, you could say, well, this person's worse than me. Paul says, it doesn't matter. You're still guilty. You're just as guilty as they are. And that guilt, the result of that guilt is ultimately death. Now, understand that when Paul says death, Paul's not referring to like, hey, we're all going to die one day and end up in a coffin and they're going to bury us. That's not what he's talking about. Because for Paul, we're all going to die. I hate to break it to you if you didn't know that, but we're all going to die at some point. When Paul talks about death, he actually says in Romans, he says, the wages of sin is death. What sin brings in our life is death. Paul's not talking about like physical. Paul's actually talking about the condition in which we live and the destination to which we are headed. Paul's saying the problem is because we're guilty, we live under the constant shadow of death. Death is the reality in which we live. As people, we are dying. Creation is dying. Our world is dying. That is the reality under which we live. It is also the destination to which we are headed. Ultimately, this is where our sin and guilt takes us, is to an eternity of death. Paul says, this is the situation in which we all find ourselves. And here's the thing, we all know this. Because how many times in your life have you hated yourself? Have you lived with guilt or shame or regret or pain for what you have done to yourself, to someone else, to the world around you? How many times have we looked in the mirror and thought, how could I? How could I be so stupid? How could I be so dumb? Why would I do this? See, we don't need someone else to tell us that we're guilty because at some point in all of our lives, we've all felt guilty. That's the bad news. After Paul lays out the bad news, then he gets to the good news. And Paul starts saying that's the condition and the reality in which we live, but the good news is that God came to earth in the person of Jesus to rescue us from that. And Paul goes on to talk about Jesus and his life and his death and his resurrection. And this is where he gets to chapter 8. And in chapter 8 now he's going to say, here's the difference the resurrection makes. Here's what the resurrection means to us. So this is what he says. He says, therefore, because of the resurrection, there is now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. Because through Christ Jesus, the law of the Spirit who gives life has set you free from the law of sin and death. For what the law was powerless to do because it was weakened by the flesh, God did by sending his own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh to be a sin offering. And so he condemned sin in the flesh. And so I want to read this first line, and I want it to sink in for a minute. There is no condemnation in Christ because of the resurrection. That's what it means. Now, that word condemnation has to do with judgment. It also has to do with the kind of execution of that judgment. Right? Like you've been deemed guilty, and so your life, the reality of your life and your destination is death. That is condemnation. The judgment and the execution of that judgment, what that judgment gets you. And what Paul says is, because of the resurrection, that does not exist in Jesus. Now notice, Paul doesn't say like, hey, in Jesus, there's like slightly less condemnation. There's only a little bit of condemnation. No, Paul says, there is none. In Jesus, there is no condemnation. That Jesus, through his resurrection, he broke the power of sin and death. Whatever hold it had on us, Jesus broke it when he walked out of that tomb. That's why the resurrection is significant. Jesus broke the power of sin and death in our life. And what he did, he condemned sin. So he condemned sin, but he set us free from it. So because of the resurrection of Jesus, you and I are judged to be innocent and to be set free from whatever power sin and death had on us. When I was a kid in elementary school, my school had what I believe to this day to be the dumbest rule of any school ever. I've never known another school to have this rule. Maybe they did, but I've never heard anybody talk about it. If your school had this rule, I'm sorry that you went to an oppressive institution like I did. But the rule, it was called the freeze bell rule. And here's how the freeze bell rule worked. At the end of recess, there was a bell that rang. And when that bell rang, whatever you were doing, you just had to freeze. And you just stood there. And then, 20, 30 seconds later, there was another bell that rang. And when the second bell rang, then you went and lined up and went into your classroom. Your teacher would come out and get you to go into your classroom. Why they didn't just have one bell, and when the bell rang, you went and lined up, I have no idea. But for whatever reason, they had this freeze bell rule. And the thing about the freeze bell rule is if you broke it, it was an automatic referral to the principal. There was no grace in it at all. There was no extenuating circumstance. It was like, you broke the rule. Here's the consequence. Everybody knew it. So one day, we're out at recess, and I'm playing Foursquare with these 3 other kids in my class. I knew them. They weren't really my friends, but I knew, we were in class together. And it's like a heated game of Foursquare. We're going back and forth. And one person pushes the ball, and when the ball is mid-air over the dead center of the Foursquare court, the freeze bell rings. The ball hit the ground pretty hard. The person pushed it pretty hard, bounced off the ground, and took off toward the field. And I'm not kidding, at the same time, all 4 of us instinctively ran after the ball. It wasn't like an all-out rebellion. We weren't trying to stick it to the man. We weren't trying to have a revolution. We're going to overthrow the stupid freeze bell rule. It was an instinct. The ball was taken off toward the field. You don't want it to go all the way. You want it to get it before it rolls. So just all 4 of us instinctively went for the ball. And as soon as we did, the stupid recess monitor lady blows her whistle. You 4, stop! Oh my gosh. And then the other bell rings and all the other kids go and they line up and the teachers come out and we're over there with the recess monitor. She tells us, y'all know what you did, right? Yes, we broke the freeze bell rule. She says, I'm going to take you to your teacher and you're all getting a referral. And so as all the other kids are walking up with the teachers, we're taking the walk of shame because we're with the recess monitor and everyone knows we screwed up. And so we get into our classroom and the recess monitor walks up to our teacher and says, these 4 students broke the freeze bell rule. And the teacher says, okay. The recess monitor leaves, and all 4 of us line up in single file by the teacher's desk, and she starts writing us referrals. She writes one and everything, rips it off, gives it to the first kid. You go up and see the principal. And as I'm standing in line there, I'm literally I just kind of am a dramatic person. I always have been, always was. And so I know some of you are going, I got tons of referrals. I didn't. I didn't get in trouble. Literally, from kindergarten till I graduated my senior year of high school, I got detention 1 time. I just never got in trouble. And part of it was my mom was a teacher, my dad was a police officer. It was discipline in our house. You just didn't get in trouble. And so I'm sitting there going, oh my gosh, I'm going to get in so much trouble. My parents are going to be so ticked. And to make it worse, the principal at my elementary school was our next door neighbor. So I'm I'm going to have to go see our next door neighbor. I'm never going to hear the end of this. She's going to light me up. I'm going to have to tell my parents. Then I know she's going to come over and talk to my parents. Oh, it's going to be, and I'm just I'm going to be grounded forever. I'm going to lose video games. I'm going to lose everything. My life is literally falling apart as I'm waiting in this line. And finally, she's written referrals to the other 3 kids, and it's my turn. I'm up at the front of the line. And in that moment, a teacher from another classroom walks in. And she calls my teacher over, and the 2 of them are talking. And they're not talking about anything that has to do with our situation. She just had to tell her something else. So they talk, and I'm still standing there sweating this whole thing out. Then that teacher leaves. My teacher comes back to her desk, and she picks up the referral pad. And she picks the pen. And she gets ready to start writing, and she stops. And she looks at me, and she goes, you ever going to break the freeze bell rule again? I was like, no, ma'am. I will never, ever break the freeze bell rule. She says, okay. Puts the pad in the pen down. She goes, you can go back. You can go back to your seat. You're okay. And I just remember walking back. I have no idea why. I don't know if she hated those other 3 kids and loved me. Maybe that teacher gave her good news. Still to this day, I have no idea why she did that. I don't have a clue. But I just remember walking back to my desk, and it was thank you, Jesus. I have my life has now been restored. Because I don't have to go sit in front of my neighbor and get yelled at. She's not going to come over and talk to my parents. I don't have to go home and tell my parents why I got a referral. I'm not going to get grounded. Everything changed. All of a sudden, hey, the world is bright again. Life has been restored to me. And see, this is what Paul's getting at. Paul's saying this is the power of the resurrection. This is what the resurrection does. Is in the resurrection, Jesus broke the power of sin and death. And so the reality in which we live and the destiny to which we are headed, those are gone. Now, this is really important. In the little story I shared with you, fortunately, I did not have any consequences for my mistake. Paul's not saying we never have any consequences. That's not what he's saying at all. That, yeah, there's some times in our life where we do things and someone else, like my teacher, has grace on us for whatever reason, and we don't suffer consequences. That happens sometimes. But Paul will even say later on in Romans 8, he'll say, listen, our present suffering does not compare to our future glory. So even Paul acknowledges, like, hey, when we make mistakes, we're still going to suffer consequences. If you violate a relationship in your life, there's consequences for that. If you break a law, Paul's not saying you'll never, ever have consequences. Again, Paul's thinking way bigger than that. Paul's zooming out and saying, what we are rescued from is the hold that sin and death have on our life. That no longer defines us. We no longer live in the reality of sin and death is not our destiny. The resurrection has set us free from that. Essentially, Paul's saying that we have actually crossed over from death to life. And here's what Paul goes on to say in Romans 8, verse 10. He says, but if Christ is in you, then even though your body is subject to death, see, Paul's saying we're still going to physically die, but because of sin, the Spirit gives life because of righteousness. And if the Spirit of him who raised Jesus from the dead is living in you, he who raised Christ from the dead will also give life to your mortal bodies because of his Spirit who lives in you. And so Paul goes, okay, look, here's how this works. When you become a follower of Jesus, the first thing you do, this happened in the New Testament, happens now, is you're baptized. And baptized literally means to dunk or to immerse. And the whole point of baptism is you take one thing and place it completely into something else. So we place our life into Jesus. And it's essentially this act of surrender that says, hey, I'm trusting you to kind of lead and guide my life. Paul says, when that happens, we place our life into Jesus. He then places his Spirit into us. Spirit is another word for presence. You ever see that word in the Bible? Spirit of God, it just literally means his presence. So when we place our life into Jesus, he places his Spirit into us. And this is where Paul, he goes, I need you to really understand what that means. That the same Spirit that brought Jesus back from the dead, the same Spirit that resurrected Jesus now lives within you. See, Paul's explaining, you want to know why your reality changes? You want to know why your destiny changes? You want to know why you're no longer bound to live in this life of sin and death? You want to know why you're no longer destined to live eternity in death? Because within you lies the same resurrection power that brought Jesus back to life. And when that happened, in that moment, you crossed over from death to life. And your reality and your destiny completely changed. The reality of your life and the destination to which you are headed completely changed because of that resurrection power that now lives within you. This is what Paul's wanting us to understand. He's wanting us to understand the significance of what all of this means. And so what's really cool is Paul then is going to spend the rest of the letter, for the most part, he's going to spend the rest of Romans, which this is what we're going to look at over the next several weeks. Paul's going to spend the rest of the letter explaining how do we live a Spirit-filled life. Like, what does that even mean? Because, okay, we have this presence of God within us, this resurrection power within us that is kind of leading and guiding us. And Paul's really going to go on to say, listen, what it means to be a Christian is that you learn to live your life in such a way as you are living in step and in sync with that Spirit that's inside of you. And so we have to live our life in a certain way. We have to live our life with certain rhythms that allow us to live in step with that Spirit. And this is where we're going to go for the rest of our time in Romans for the next few weeks. So starting next week, Paul's going to start to get really practical and say, this is what it means to live life according to that Spirit that is alive within you. And so that's where we're going to go. It's going to be great. Paul's got a lot of really amazing practical stuff to say to us. But before we get there, I want us to be really clear at what Paul is getting at. Because again, this is kind of like the pinnacle of the first part of his argument. It's all leading up toward his really explaining the power of the resurrection. See, the resurrection is the thing that defines faith, it defines Christianity, it defines what it's all about. See, the word resurrection, we just talk about the word resurrection. Here's what this word means. This word means that something was dead and now it's alive again. That's what it's meant, that's what it has always meant. Something died and something came along. This is what happened on that first Easter. This is what Matthew and John wrote about, Mark and Luke wrote about. This is what Paul said, hey, talk to these 500 people. This is what all these people witnessed. He was dead, and then he's alive again. And here's what's really interesting. In John 22, when Jesus is talking about the end of the world or the end of the age or the afterlife or whatever you want to call it, you know the word Jesus uses to describe that? Resurrection. Jesus talks about resurrection is our destiny. See, like probably a lot of us, I grew up with this mindset that there's a difference between physical and spiritual, that those are like different realities. And one of the ways those realities manifest themselves is when we think about ourselves as people. It's like we have a physical body, but then within that body, we talk about the fact that we have a soul. And so I grew up kind of believing that, hey, when my physical body dies, which it will one day, my soul will escape my physical body and it will go up into heaven and I'll get a harp and a halo, and heaven's like this ethereal place in the clouds and there's like streets of gold, but we all kind of float around. And even when I was a kid, that's what happens in cartoons, right? Cartoons, a cartoon character dies and their ghost kind of flies out and away. And that's just the worldview that I grew up with, that that's what's going to happen. When we die, my soul will leave my body and it will go up into heaven. And I just always assumed, well, that's a Christian worldview. That's Jesus talked about that, or Paul talked about that, or it's in the New Testament. I grew up, and you know what I learned? Jesus didn't talk about that. Paul didn't talk about that. You know where that comes from? Plato. The guy, not the stuff. He's a guy. If you don't know him, you can Google him. Pretty important, like Greek philosophical thinker. But Plato was the guy who made that argument big. He kind of built off his predecessor, who was Aristotle, but it's Plato's the guy who made that view famous. That, yes, there's this soul that is separate from our body, and the soul lives on after we die. So the physical kind of dies, and the soul goes somewhere else and becomes something else. That's not the language that Jesus used when he talked about the afterlife or the end of the age. The language Jesus used was resurrection, which means what? Something's dead, and now it's alive again. And so when Jesus talked about the resurrection, it wasn't just this like ethereal thing. It was very like physical and practical. Right? Even John, when John in the book of Revelation, last book in the Bible, when John describes the end of the age, you know what John talks about? John talks about how heaven comes to earth and heaven and earth are joined together. And when that happens, you know what God does? He makes everything new. That literally, he is resurrecting everything. You and I and the world in which we live and the creation that he made. See, this is why in Romans, when Paul talks about how resurrection is our destination, this is what Paul's getting at, that this is where everything is going. You know where human history is going? You know where it's leading toward? It's leading toward God resurrecting everything around us that is currently dying, including ourselves. That he's making it all new. That's the destination. That's where we're headed. That's where all of this is going, to resurrection. In 1 Corinthians 15, Paul talks about, it's interesting, Paul talks about Jesus' resurrected body. That Jesus, and all those crazy post-resurrection stories I mentioned, Jesus is like, after his resurrection, he's different. Like he has a physical body because people touch it and stuff, but his physical body is different. Like he can do things he couldn't do before. He literally like can just show up in places where like all the doors and windows are locked and he's just there. And people kind of have trouble recognizing him because he looks a little bit different. So he's physical, but his body's different. And what Paul talks about is Paul says, listen, Jesus' physical, like human, whatever you want to call it, body was perishable and it died, and he was raised into this imperishable new body. And Paul says the same thing about us. Here's what he writes in 1 Corinthians 15. He says, listen, I'll tell you a mystery. We will not all sleep, but we will all be changed in a flash, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet. So again, he's talking about the end. And he says, for when the trumpet will sound, the dead will be raised, which is resurrection. You're dead, you're alive again. Imperishable. And we will all be changed. See, Paul says, this is where it's going. You know what happens at the end? At the end, it is resurrection. It is God brings life to everything around us that is dying. A lot of us look around our world. A lot of us look at our lives, and it's like, it's falling apart. I'm falling apart. Everything's falling apart. But Paul reminds us, he says, yeah, but remember where it's going. It's going here. It's going to resurrection. Paul, if you go back to Romans 8, he says this line in Romans 8, I love it. He talks about the redemption of our bodies. See, one of the mistakes we have made with our kind of understanding of Christian faith is we've always made the goal of it, like to escape and to go somewhere else and you just got to survive this life, and then you get out of here and you fly away to somewhere else. But that's not what Jesus talked about. That's not what Paul talked about. That's not what resurrection is all about. Resurrection is about you and I. It is about this place. It is about everything God has made, and it is about God bringing it back to life, even in the midst of death. See, the whole point of Christianity is transformation. Is that God is transforming us to look more and more like Jesus. And the means for him doing that is resurrection. Resurrection is the power through which God is transforming us to look more like Jesus. And one day, that will all be realized in the end. When Jesus returns, at the end of the world, the end of the age, whatever you want to call it, when this great resurrection happens, then we will have these imperishable bodies and we will share fully in the resurrection. But I think sometimes we forget that resurrection power is already still alive in us. That's what Paul writes in Romans 8. You don't have to wait for that power. It's already in you. If you put your life into Jesus, he put his spirit into you, and resurrection power lives in you now. And so that transformation in our life, for us to look more like Jesus, we don't wait till the end. It's happening now. Here's what Paul writes in another letter to that same church in Corinth. He says, and we all who with unveiled faces contemplate the Lord's glory are being transformed into his image with ever-increasing glory, which comes from the Lord who is the Spirit. Paul says, yeah, resurrection is our destiny. It's our destination. It's where we're going. It's what God is going to do. But it's also the reality in which we live now. That if we've placed our life into Jesus, his Spirit lives within us, and that resurrection power is within us now, and that resurrection power is already bringing life to our mortal bodies. See, resurrection, the reason we celebrate resurrection, the reason resurrection is important, because resurrection is the announcement that wherever you are in your life, you are not stuck there. That whatever your current reality is, this is not your end. Whatever habits, whatever addictions, whatever destructive lifestyle, whatever is destroying your self, your family, your relationships, that does not have to define you. That doesn't have to be your reality. It doesn't have to be your destination. That resurrection says there is always hope. That even in the midst of the death that you and I live in, God is bringing life. That we live in the reality of resurrection. And we hold on to the hope that resurrection is our destination. And that is why we celebrate Easter.